Welcome to ChinaParadigm Podcast, where we share insights and stories from successful entrepreneurs and business people in China and learn what it takes to succeed in a wide range of industries. We interviewed Douglas Corley, who is a Beijing-based healthcare entrepreneur and the co-founder and CEO at DHB Global. For 10 years, DHB Global has acted as a bridge between foreign private healthcare companies trying to get into the Chinese healthcare market and the Chinese healthcare regulatory institutions to facilitate successful transitions from foreign frameworks and regulations to Chinese frameworks and regulations. Listen and learn. How does DHB Global facilitate the link between Chinese public health institutions and foreign private healthcare companies trying to sell their services in the Chinese market? Deep Dive, the Chinese Healthcare System. Healthy China 2030. What are the main directions? What is DHB Global's experience in dealing with the COVID-19 crisis? What advice would present-day Douglas Corley have for himself of 10 years ago? And much more.
Hello everyone, I'm Matthew David, the founder of Dash Consulting and its podcast, ChinaParadigm. And today I am with Douglas Corley. You are healthcare entrepreneur, CEO and co-founder of DHB Global. And what I was very amazed by, you started as a pianist, classical pianist. It's correct, right?
Yes.
It's correct.
That's a natural transition.
and you moved to study biomedicine, and you have to explain later on how you can move from be trained as a classical pianist, then study and focused on biomedicine, and to end up in Dalian to study Chinese, and finally, I believe, moving to Beijing to find new opportunities, and you found them. You found them because you worked with very, very, very Chinese institutions, very local ones. Peking University Hospital, 301, I don't know if you say 301 or Sanbai Ling Yi or San Ling Yao. Sanlingyao. Okay. Military hospital. So that's how they named the hospital by the number. So it's 301 military hospital in Beijing. So when I say very local, it's very, very local because it's within the military complex, let's say, or linked to military.
It's actually, it goes by 301 or the PLA hospital. In other words, it is where the officials go when they need to get treatment.
PLA
so it's not really PLA for the People's Liberation Army.
Yeah.
So it's actually where all of the government officials go for everything, and their families, and kind of historically some of the elite families across China.
Oh, it's amazing. And they,
I might be the only Caucasian American that you'll meet that has worked there for a handful of years.
That's why I wanted to ask. They could admit a foreigner.
Yeah, I think. Let's see, I arrived in China 2011, and about 8 months plus in Dalian, and was really, really fortunate there. I met, my China story kind of begins as everybody's does, which is I was really curious about the language and the culture, and my touch point actually, I remember being, 12, 13 years old, going into bookstores, and you see the magazine covers. And I remember always seeing for the Hong Kong handover, you see the dragon on the cover and it says East meets West, culture clash. I never understood why it would be such a culture clash. People are people. We want the next generation to have a better life than we had. And, why should it be so different in a different culture? So that was always in the back of my head. And then high school and college, we touched on Confucius and Mencius and some of the traditional ideologies in China. And then we touched a lot on Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist philosophy, because we actually had some of the premier Marx scholars for some reason at my alma mater at Creighton University. So shout out to Dr. Amy Wendling. She was super, super sharp. She had done I think she actually did part of her, if not all of her degree in German at the Max Planck. So like fluent, really got deeply involved in the philosophy. And I graduated and in December 2010, moved to China, January 2011. And, every Laowai kind of moves to China and it's like, okay, what's the easiest way for me to get there? And for me, it was teaching English. It was just the fastest, quickest way. And, that's where the China story began. And I was, one of like a handful of foreigners kind of within the circle, teaching in an English school and really just deeply immersed in language. That was my whole goal, was I'll be here for 6 months. And I actually told my family 6 months and I'll be back, because I was supposed to go back and do, medical school or something along those lines. And my brother, I think I went home after 1 calendar year, and he punched me in the arm. He was like, 6 months, huh? We had a running bet in the family that, and everybody had a number, and you outlasted all of us. None of us thought you would last that long. So 6 months turned into 9 years.
Back to the US to meet with family, and then back again to Beijing that time. And here we are, right?
That's right.
And here we are,
Yes.
where you studied at the Chinese Academy of Science and working, I believe, part-time at Peking University Hospital and back to the military hospital in Beijing. And at that time, you understood more about business in healthcare in China. As far as I understand, you understood that there was a gap to fill in the smaller maybe deals, the smaller projects that was not interesting for the big corporation, that you could actually do a lot within this segment. And you funded then what we call initially the Beijing Health Forum, BHF, to get the players together to actually create this bridge, this East meets West, right? And this time without conflict, with cooperation. And later on, you transform the Beijing Health Forum into DHF. And by the way, I don't know, DHB, sorry, Global.
That's right.
And what does it stand for, DHB?
Sure. So let me quickly clarify one point. When I was working, it was kind of daytime doing basic science in CAS, or Chinese Academy of Sciences, or Zhongkuyuan. And my work there was really trying to work on really basic science problems. So, identifying molecules, publishing papers around that, and elucidating pathways, figuring out how diseases progress, how molecules can then target or be targeted for treatment, and then figuring out what a treatment or a diagnostic modality might look like. So the reason I mention that and specify is because that is very much like an R&D laboratory in a pharma company, but they didn't quite have that thought process. A lot of what I was doing initially was working with some just incredibly sharp students, postdocs, and professors who are, just light years smarter than me. But what I noticed with some of the students and the postdocs was you could give them a specific linear pathway and a specific problem to think about. But as soon as it deviated, trying to go back and retool and rejigger to try and find alternate uses or other applications of what they found was very difficult. And that led to this becoming a translational research lab, which means they're trying to commercialize. So I was really seeing a lot of that as it began. So it wasn't me kind of as the driving force behind it, but it was, this is very clearly a direction that China will go. And I was just really, really fortunate, right place, right time, to see that really the beginning of the wave of how people were trying to figure out, Chinese academic scholars in the laboratory, how do we begin to commercialize these things? And since then, there's been a huge proliferation. And similar to that, some of the work that I did, kind of moonlighting with the PLA and also with what's called Xiehe, or Peking Union Medical College Hospital. Those were in different areas. At 301, it was in liver surgery and what's called the hepatobiliary department. And then in Peking, it was in cardiovascular, so chronic disease. So infectious disease, chronic disease, and specific kinds of cancers. And I'm sorry, the second half of your question was what?
What does DHB stand for? A much more simple question.
Sure. So the ancient Silk Road had a city along it called Dunhuang. If you remember where the dunes are, it's very famous as a tourist spot. And that was also the historical area where everything for healthcare was traded. So that is thinking about like a modern Silk Road, the Yidailu. It just made so much sense trying to identify a name, a title, and something that's, really resonates with the Chinese community that shows, a historical understanding of what Belt and Road was, and hopefully what it will be this go around.
Interesting. Very good name.
And then the B stands for bio, because healthcare.
Okay, I see. So far, you have worked with many hospitals, research institutions, both from the US and across Europe. You counted them as more than 100 from the US and more than 150 from Europe. As an open question, actually, more on your business. Sure. What services do you provide to them? I feel you are providing a very large scope of services, from introduction to partners to be with them in the process of working within China, research. Mm-hmm. So, would you mind sharing a bit of a segment of the services you offer?
Sure. And, in the kind of pre-COVID world, in the traditional consulting services for hospitals in the US or in Europe that wanted market entry, the high level would be, we'll just help you better understand market segmentation. What does the current academic and clinical research look like in China? What are the typical partners? And just keeping it at a macro level, tier 1 cities, tier 2 cities, and tier 3 cities, everybody knows typically what that means. So 第一线, 第二线, 第三线城市. But then when you get into hospitals, the segmentation is a bit different. So there you have what's called 三家, 二家, 一家, or 三家A, 三家B. And tier 3A, which is 三家A, is the highest level. And the reason it's important to differentiate, within America, that would be like an R1 institution. So you have teaching. The professors have to teach, they have to have patients and have an active clinic, and they also have to publish. So those three things make it an R1 institution in America, and the equivalent is a Sanjia A in China. The difficulty is to find professors that have the bandwidth, that have the interest, and just being very transparent, have the incentive to try and partner with overseas groups. And because some of them are very much focused just on publishing papers, and those are their KPIs to work their way up kind of their totem pole, to ultimately become what's called an academician or a 主任 in Chinese Academy of Sciences. It's the highest honor in Chinese academia. That's typically the first service. And then from there, once they say, okay, we really know that we want to enter the China market, then the question is which kind of city, which kind of hospital, and really beginning to get very granular. And that typically would be a roadshow of some sort. So helping hospitals come and visit, see the surgery ward, visit some of the hospitals, speak with administrators. If there's kind of a commercial application trying to bring patents over or trying to do co-create IP or commercialize IP locally, then you would start to meet with some of the incubators within the universities, because 8 years ago compared to now, it's a totally different ecosystem. And trying to speak with some of the local financiers who are really actively involved in these cross-border commercializations. And then, for a handful of clients, what we did was we would actually be we'd essentially act as a venture builder. So they'd say, okay, we understand where we would like to go in the market. We understand which products or assets we'd like to bring into the market, but we still don't know how to operate in the market. So what we could do is package that all together and offer that as a turnkey solution. So at the end of our term together, you'll have an operational team, you'll have received grants within China, and you will have, if you need a laboratory or if you need academic partnerships or distribution for products, we can set these things up. So that's the traditional consulting kind of pre-COVID normal, what we had offered.
I see. What's surprising to me is that how do you connect those private businesses, commercially oriented, with those institutions in China which are very deeply rooted into the state, into government, into public operation, public service? Is it? You said it's difficult because they are basically their KPIs is about papers, is about other KPIs and being a commercial partnership with companies. So could you explain more about what you are doing with just two different types of organizations?
Sure. So the private groups or the public groups from overseas, their goal, and let's take, famous University X from America or from Europe, not to name any names. The professors there oftentimes are given a grant either by the university or their federal government to identify a molecule to create patents and then to do something with it. And then sometimes what happens is the IP department in the university takes hold of it and they have 100% ownership. Sometimes the individual professor has total ownership of it. It really depends on the university. I mean, that's the first kind of major difference. If you're looking at some of the European universities that had problems during the economic crisis, they actually sold 25 to 50% of all of the future IP that comes out of their science departments to big financiers. So it really depends on where you are. It changes pretty dramatically. Once those groups have been identified, whether it's the professor, it's the science department, it's the IP departments, whoever the stakeholder overseas is, then bringing them into China, that's the hard part. So the first hard part is, who exactly holds the IP, who's the actual decision maker. On the China side, it's a similar exercise. You need to map out who are the stakeholders and who are the decision makers, and then what matters to them. And oftentimes, as we now have the 14th 5-year plan, a lot of what China would like to do is to have domestic sustainable economic growth. And the 13th 5-year plan was very much about innovation and trying to build and really just expand IP across every industry. And typically what that has looked like for every 5-year plan in healthcare is we'd like to have more precise patents. We'd like to be able to commercialize more. We'd like to actually innovate on our own. And specifically how you map these two together is you say, okay, University X in America, Chinese University Y, you guys can have an academic partnership. You can create a joint venture in theory that would be able to house the patents together, 50-50 ownership, or whatever is agreed upon. And then each side has specific responsibilities. Here are the covenants. This group needs to bring in the distribution rights. This group needs to bring in the scientific know-how to be able to really bring it to completion, to really develop the idea beyond just we found a molecule, to do the clinical trials and to do all the analytics behind it. So those are some of the functions that need to be done after the initial partnership is created. And then it's a lot of relationship management because there's a lot of cultural differences just within academia, how papers are published. And, for anyone who's filed the patents, maybe you go with this really broad overarching patents, and that's only one, what's called a PCT filing. So you have this massive broad patent, or you slice them up until you have 20 or 50 or 100 or 200 patents. It really depends on you. And depending on where you're practicing your clinical stuff or where you're publishing your papers and filing your patents, universities will incentivize you differently. So you maybe in your best interest to file 200 patents because you'll make more money. It may be better for you to do one big broad thing and then over the course of 2 years, try to commercialize it because that gives you the best long-term strategic competitive moat, right? So it really depends on where you're coming from. And each side of the ocean has different things to keep in mind. So historically in China, they're going to, chop papers up and, one really big idea gets turned into 15 papers. One big patent gets turned into however many patents. I would say that that's changing. I don't know how quickly, but I know that there's been a huge amount of crackdown. There were kind of government investigations and nothing insidious, but just, kind of every year budgets were reviewed. And, some of the academics in China could get paid 15 up to 30 or 50,000 US per publication in really high-end medical journals. Academic journals. And when their American counterparts hear that, they go, wait, what? I don't get paid anything extra for this. So you start to see the incentives are totally different.
Interesting. From someone outside the industry, I feel when you are mentioning those systems and those commercialization process from universities and universities making money out of invention discoveries, it looks like much more Western style system. But what you are saying is that in its own way, China has a very very strong incentive, also monetary incentives for finding patents for professors, for researchers. So actually, the gap between the culture gap is not that big between the West and China in terms of being incentivized from a commercial perspective, financial perspective, in discovery. But one of the maybe large difference is that I don't see in China that many universities being run as a business, whereas it could exist in the US. Am I correct to see that as a main difference?
Yes and no. I'd say just at a high level, many U.S. universities, and actually, I'd be curious your thoughts, many U.S. universities are famous for their endowments. I don't know if that's even popular or common amongst European universities. And I know that it's not, at least as of 5 years ago, within Chinese universities. They're trying, and we can get to Schwarzman College within Tsinghua as a bit of maybe an example of where that might change. But that doesn't mean that they're not run like businesses. And there's one caveat that I'll add to it, which is in some US and European universities, novel ideas are really strongly emphasized. Like we just, come up with something interesting. And often what happens is kind of the Shanzhai idea in China, or kind of the copycat idea. In life science research, the way that you can think of that is what's called a biosimilar. And the simplest way to come up with mental imagery for it is imagine a molecule and then add one little thing to the top of it. So you have a benzene ring and now you add a hydroxyl group, whatever it is, like just one specific modification to it. Now you have a new molecule. Go patent that. Oh, now you add two things to it. Oh, you have another new molecule. Go patent for that. And so you have these patents or paper mills. And I don't know, it's very chicken egg. I don't know if you could categorize that as the university being run like a business, or if it's the professors being very entrepreneurial, seeing it and saying, you know what, this is interesting. And maybe we'll be able to come up with something out of it. But at the very least, this is going to generate some business. So it's a different approach to it. And not to say that these things don't happen in the West. I'm sure that they do. But, like my time was in academia in China, and then since then is really helping some of the U.S. institutions, like very top end universities, try to figure out where they can bring their, for instance, CAR T treatments that was invented by a professor at UPenn, and I think I was not part of the deal, but I believe his initial deal to create a company named Juno Therapeutics, I think he got a very large seed investment. I think it was either 300 or 600 million USD. So, the scale of these life science deals are very different to technology, to digital solutions.
Would you mind sharing a precise example to illustrate those services you worked on, which could illustrate best the scope of services you provide?
Sure. For NCNDA and document reasons, I can't name companies, but we worked with a very large publicly traded company that had a really novel way of diagnosing and managing chronic disease. And they looked at 15 countries around the world. Obviously, China is such a large population and such a fast-growing economy. It's always on their list. And so what we did was market segmentation, SWOT analysis, client interview, commercial partner interview, academic partner interview. And that went all the way into us helping set up manufacturing lines for them in country and taking royalty on that, and also taking a lot of their academic patents that they were working on to further differentiate their product and finding them academic partners within China. So in total, it was about an 18-month partnership, and they now have a legal entity in China. They have manufacturing split between China and India. And I think they're still waiting for their product approval because that takes anywhere from 12 to 36 months because, red tape. But yeah, that's one pretty specific example of what we've done. A a lot of the earlier stage things, so pre-markets, is a lot of just academic partnerships, a lot of financier stakeholder mapping, and really putting them in touch, and then being able to help raise money or help raise grants through some of the academic partnerships. And those are much more straightforward, but just the overall kind of venture building, it was literally building the company, setting up the distribution, setting up the facilities, and then being able to hand that back over.
Then I'm going to my next question, actually, which is a natural question linked to what just you said, that it requires a lot of different skills, a lot of different aspects, like building a factory, managing academics, finding an agreement between the two institutions, and so on and so on. Patents, I mean, understanding all this world and executing different aspects. How did you organize your team to do that? Do you rely on other companies and other people outside of your team to do that, or have you internalized everything with every skill, or yourself able to have enough directions, principles, ideas to be able to know where to go?
Sure. Certainly need to delegate and need to make sure that you have people who are boots on the ground, either internal or external staffers. And so for a lot of the legal work, my goal has always been to just have somebody that's amazing at what they do and help to structure the documentation, structure the nature of the new entity that will be built. And really from day one, like, okay, Doug, here are the 5 possible, think of it like an engineering problem. Here are the 5 possible structures and all the rate limiting steps. Here are the considerations for each of these. Let's begin the conversation, and then we will figure out, based on feedback, which of these pathways we're most likely going down. And at some points, I'm doing the negotiation, I'm doing all of these things up front. At some points, we will have more than 2 stakeholders when we have to engage, 3rd or 4th groups. And at that point, I'll have a project manager take over as kind of principal communications person. And they're able to go and organize. I think my strong value add is being able to go and really initiate and maintain conversations and negotiate. But needing to do day-to-day operations, I already have a team to do that for. So kind of having to keep that hat on all the time just stretches a bit thin. So we'll have project management in-house. We'll have product design, sometimes as it's needed in-house. We're very fortunate to have some medical experts as advisors for our company. And we've done some considerable work there. And then when it comes to the financing, because of a lot of the relationships I've built through World Economic Forum, through some of these others, we're pretty easily able to identify whether it's a US or an Asia-based financing group that can help to really objectively take a step back and say, okay, what is the market potential? How should we value this assets? How should we help to fundraise this? What sort of financing should you look for?
When you mentioned product design, could you elaborate more? I'm not seeing a very easy connection to what you just said before.
Sure. So thinking of, sometimes you'll have a molecule and you're not going to redesign the molecule, but you may need to do a lot of paperwork around setting up a clinical trial so that both sides of the academic partnership understand what they're looking at. And then when you pull in an organization called a CRO, or a contract research organization that does the day-to-day laboratory work, you need somebody that's a project manager for that. But it's not a project manager as overall, the way I've thought of it, as a product designer, right?
Interesting.
Because they're really making sure that the entire academic literature that's being created and all the data that's being analyzed is very clear. Yes. So if you're doing a therapeutic, that's often the case. If you're doing a medical device, there's a lot of product design that goes into that, right? So if you have hardware or software, there's a huge amount of product design that comes there. So we've worked on digital therapeutics. We've worked on, molecular therapeutics. We've also worked on hardware, so a medical device, something that is implanted or something that you wear on your body. So when you start to think of these physical things instead of a pill or molecule, then it's more obvious that you would need product
Yeah, for that aspect, I understand the product design, the use of the word product design, and still, I find it amazing that you are able to cover such a large scope. I mean, in product design in itself, it could be a company in itself that to help to redesign, repackage, adapt, or optimize a specific product for the Chinese market, which is what you contribute to, if I'm correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's HR is the biggest part of it, and we've been really fortunate. We have some amazing staff who are with us now, or who have been with us in the past, who are medical doctors, PhDs, Ivy League educated, or top Chinese university educated. And at the end of the day, I think the biggest hurdle in life science in this area of kind of commercialization is having, number one, a baseline of background knowledge. It doesn't have to be PhD level. The biggest rate limiting step is a desire to just learn one facet really well. And so the phrase that my team, I think, gets sick of hearing is, I don't want an army, I want a SWAT team. Because that's we need to be small, nimble, and be able to go in and just really figure out everything in this room ASAP. And each person needs to be very clear with their responsibility. So if you have a big team, sometimes it's too much.
How many people are we talking about?
Maybe a team of 8 people.
Okay, so then you have external support, I believe, which is exactly the person with the right knowledge, and it through your network and through all the connections you have built over the last 10 years. I see.
Exactly.
I understand.
Exactly.
So
we can handle 2 to 3 projects at a time with an 8-person staff. Really, it should be 1 to 2 persons as point for each project. So whether it's overall project and then product.
I see. I didn't mention it, but currently we are shooting the podcast from respectively Shanghai and Thailand because you are within this COVID period stuck in Thailand. But all your team is in Beijing, if I'm correct.
Hong Kong, actually, Beijing, Hong Kong. Yeah.
Beijing and Hong Kong. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I like that we do a bit of a deep dive into the healthcare system in China. You already mentioned this system of different kinds of hospitals, the most prestigious ones having research, clinical tests, and professors linked to universities, and so on. And the 3 level of A, right? You have 3A, 2A, and 1A.
2A, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's not linked necessarily to the tier cities. You could have some maybe cities with large population, but without the 3A, for instance, if my understanding is correct, or it's pretty correlated.
Actually, the last time I checked the statistics, 80+% of all Sanya A hospitals are in Beijing and Shanghai.
Wow, that's even more concentrated than what I just said then.
Yes, it is very much. So if you're living in Beijing or Shanghai and you go to most any public hospital, it is more likely than not a Sanya A hospital. If my very good friend of mine is from Inner Mongolia, Nemang, and I believe the entire province of Inner Mongolia has 1 or 2. And if you know what the size of that is relative to the size of China overall, it's a very, very, it's very difficult to get into those hospitals. It's very large. The population is huge. If you go to Zhejiang and some of the eastern area, it's very developed. If you go west, it's much harder to find. So if you go back to, some of the traditional pain points in healthcare in China, everybody's trying to go to Beijing to see a doctor there. And this is why, because the best trained doctors historically are in Beijing and Shanghai. And up until maybe 4 years ago, there were no policies that allowed those doctors to go to smaller cities and practice. Many of these doctors are from small cities, did really well in high school and did great on the Gaokao and got into Shanghai, Jiaotong Daxue, or wherever it was. And they've never gone home. They would love to go home, but the way that the requirements are for medical school training, postgraduate training, fellowship training, they just never get a chance to go home. And by the time they finish all their training, they're 35 or 40 years old, and they already have a wife and kids, and they're in Beijing or Shanghai. Why would they move all the way back to a small city in Anhui where the medical equipment, medical staff, and the infrastructure is totally different than what they know. They don't know how to use this stuff anymore. So it's this really interesting kind of not bipolarity, but just very, very different system. So even within China, you have what most of us Laowai often see, and then you have, really go to your nearest tier 5 city community health center. You'll be very surprised at the level of clinical care based on what they have.
You mean surprised positively, right?
Yes, yeah. They're able to do a lot with relatively little.
I see. So among the system, what you are saying is that it's very concentrated. So the top hospitals, the top healthcare system is concentrated in Shanghai and Beijing, and people from all the provinces are going to Beijing and Shanghai to go to those hospitals. And what about? So we are talking about public hospitals.
Correct.
Are we somewhere seeing something which could be a private sector developing, which could see actually the interest of developing very high quality services in those cities? Like, when we talk about Chengdu, Chongqing, Changsha,
Sure.
we are talking about the size of Belgium. To put in a perspective, and in terms of population.
Short answer is yes, but last time I checked the numbers, the number of hospital beds in China by percentage, it was roughly 90% of all beds are public. So I believe it was the 2020 Healthy China policy. There's a new one that's 2025. They wanted the numbers to be, I think, 75 or 80% public. So they were really trying to spur along investments into private. And I think that was happening positively for a while, and especially around elder care. So what's called the silver wave, the booming elder age population, and medical beds, medical facilities for them. There's been a huge amount of infrastructure built, but a huge gap still is having what's called an MHA, which is MHA is a degree that you can earn. It's a healthcare administrator. So historically, the people that end up running hospitals were medical doctors who were just stud students and were super sharp and maybe didn't want to do clinical care or surgery. So they became administrators. Or maybe they just were good academics and they kind of got burnt out and they shifted. Anyway, the point is, historically, 20, 30 years, there isn't this really strong admin, finance, budgeting, sort of infrastructure or education track. And that has started to change. I think, 3 years ago or so, Johns Hopkins partnered with Tsinghua to offer a professional degree, a doctorate. And I think the first cohort is either graduated last year or will be graduating this year. So we're seeing some of these gaps start to be filled. But I think, they're not going to be graduating 100,000 students per year. There's still going to be a large gap for a while. But there's definitely a desire for more private health. But keep in mind, historically, public hospitals, that's where you went. And that's where the best academics are. And even today, for the best private hospitals, it's almost impossible for them to lure away the famous doctors. The famous doctors are in the public hospitals. So you may have a prettier looking building, but if you don't have you have the hardware, but if you don't have the software, what good does it do? And so that's been the push and pull on the policy side, is how do we let these doctors who are from these smaller cities go back and practice, but they come back to Beijing or Shanghai or whichever big city they live in, because we need that talent. So you're starting to see cities work better with the big cities, like Hangzhou, for example, trying to find a way to build their own private medical school to attract, some of these students.
Talking about 90% of beds being in the public sector, moving down to 75% as an objective, with
75 to 80, yeah.
So it's 75 to 80%. So basically, that's more than doubling the number of beds in the private sector. And meanwhile, maybe the public sector is growing. So the change is even bigger for the private sector. Is it in a 5-year plan? Is it something which has been stated? You mentioned just a plan, which is the healthcare 2025, which is something which is 2025, right? Which is something much less known than the Made in China 2025 or other programs which are very well marketed by the Chinese government. But this one is a bit less known. Would you mind sharing a little bit about the healthcare 2025? What's inside? What's the main directions?
Sure, and I may be misremembering. There's the every 5-year policy, and then it may actually be the Healthy China 2030. I'll double check. It's been a while since I read the actual paper. I believe it came out in maybe 2018 or 2019. And the goal of it really is to have enough. I think the tagline is domestic innovation, sustainable health system, and sustainable infrastructure. So they want to have enough domestic manufacturing of medicines, enough doctors. If you look at OECD numbers, per capita, so per 10,000 patients, how many doctors there are, China ranks pretty low. I think in Europe, on average, it's about 4 or 5 doctors per 10,000, which is not terribly high. In China, I think it's 2. It was roughly half of Western developed countries. So just the number of doctors is not there. And then you go to the secondary, the nurses and secondary staff, and there's very, very few of them. So just the amount of clinical care that needs to be built is very, very complicated. And the government knows this. So they're building these longer term academic partnerships to trenching with Johns Hopkins. They're also trying to use technology like AI so that you can have one doctor see more patients, right? You don't need an expert to do everything because, if you have Chinese friends, ask them about, their parents or grandparents, they only want to see the Juren, they only want to see the Zhuanjia, they only want to see like the very famous doctor, because historically there's just not that trust unless his name is on the side of the department as the chairperson. So trying to find objective tools that builds confidence and increases efficiency is a huge part of it. Manufacturing domestically and increasing the quality of that manufacturing. We've seen huge advances in this. There's been so much consolidation of the raw materials for pharmaceutical products, and also for some of the raw materials for metallics and some of those products. And what that means, you can go and just do a quick Google search. Early this year, any pharma company that wanted to sell their products for essential medicines in China had to cut their cost by 50%. And somehow they all were magically able to do it, right? So 5 years ago, their profit margins were just gigantic. And as the consolidation happens, the margin gets lesser, but maybe not by too much, because instead of there being 5,000 companies, now it's, hypothetically, let's say it's 50. And so you still have this top to bottom, from beginning to end control of raw material costs, which really allows you to better understand and predict the final sales costs. Yeah. And then the last thing I'll add is we haven't even talked about insurance and public versus private insurance. And that's a huge, huge aspect. When you're in Shanghai, there's a lot of innovation happening within that.
That's one of the questions I wanted to ask next. But before that,
sure.
The Chinese government is very pragmatic. It is known to be very pragmatic. Set up a goals, and then you set up a clear path. You you deploy the means to reach those goals. So, what about the concrete programs, the concrete things which will be done in order to reach those goals? So private insurance could be one of the tools to reach those goals. One of the goals could be public funding. One of the tools, could be public funding. What we have seen a lot in parks, in technology parks, but was much more industrial at the time. It was free space, free offices, for foreign investment, FDI, foreign direct investments.
Mm-hmm.
It was about even some money given to those companies without any commitment to reimburse or any share put in the taken in the joint venture of the company. It could be loan. It could be different formats. So, what are the formats? What are the tools sought in order to reach those objectives?
Yeah. So do you mean for hospitals specifically, or just for kind of the healthcare ecosystem?
The 3 or 4 objectives now. I don't remember exactly how many objectives are clearly stated. I remember 4, but in order to reach those objectives, what tools is the Chinese government going to use? Is it the same as what they did for industries and its specific economic zones and so on?
It's usually very similar. That it's usually through SEZs and FTZs. So, for example, there's a really interesting, unique kind of medical zone. I believe it's Hainan Haikou, or it's I'll think of it in a moment. But it's really unique, or it's in Boao. But it's very unique because there are some really big private hospitals being set up there, because you can actually sell medicine there, and only there, that does not yet have international clinical trial approval and FDA approval. So China's really trying to do everything that it can, and is doing as many public-private partnerships and just trials to see what works best. If we have like these rare diseases or these specific forms of cancer, and is there something we can do for palliative care? Is there something maybe a little bit experimental that we can see and just try and speed up the commercialization of this, bringing it into the market? So there's a huge amount trying. But in the big cities, typically it's science parks. If you have a medical device, bring it in. The difficulty for an overseas medical doctor to come and practice, I think, are still great, but not impossible. You do have, UFH and Red Leaf Hospital and some other very, significant size hospitals that have chains all across mainland China. But a foreigner to go and practice medicine in a public hospital, while I have some Chinese Canadian friends who have done it, I think they're the exception. I think just at the language level, and some of these people went to medical school in mainland China in order to do it. So they do their undergrad degree in Canada and then come here. So it's possible, but the typical incentives are, if you're going to set up a company and try and sell your product or commercialize it here, yes, Science Park, free capital, access to talents, because that's a huge part of it. So you're doing cardiovascular care. You can work with PUMCH, Peking Medical, and that will give you access to the cardiocath lab. You'll be able to find people who can work on the product and help you commercialize it, help you finish the papers and these things. And then tax incentives, tax breaks. Those are usually the main tools. Periodically, it will be, different talent grants. So I'm sure everyone's heard of the 1,000 Talent Scholars. So different grants like this. There are quite a few academics from overseas who have participated in these kinds of programs. And then outside of that, I think you have a lot of big investment funds that work pretty closely with some of these science parks. They have offices within them, and even some of the big incubators who are looking to just try and help speed up the commercialization. So they may be able to take part of that, and offer as a service, CRO, or some of the busy work that is required. So you don't have to, for instance, raise a lot of money. You can hand over part of the project to them, and in return they get equity. Instead of just giving you a lot of money, they can handle that as a service. So there are different, almost different structures for the IP commercialization within China.
It seems that it allows a lot of flexibility, and it seems that there is not a national framework on how to incentivize it, but more an opportunities framework at a provincial or city level, with a lot of decentralization. It's a bit surprising to use this word in China because it's said to be very centralized. But actually, what I found out with everything I learned about China is that you have a lot of independence actually to be very autonomous on how to implement some regulations at the provincial level and city level. As we said in ancient China, the mountains are high and the emperor is very far away. And I feel that's still the case. People can apply in a bit the way they would like to, right?
Yeah, I think in general that's right. I spent the majority of my time in Beijing, so maybe Beijing's a little bit different. But yeah, as soon as you get to even Shanghai, or specifically, you go to Shenzhen, I suppose that's the furthest. There's a huge amount of difference in terms of what a science park will offer you. For instance, in Chengdu, they have what's called Tianfu Keji Gongyuan, which is a very, very famous science park. Suzhou has Bio Bay. It's a very, very famous one. Outside of Shanghai, Zhangjiang. So it really depends on where you go. Each of these, however, will have a top-down recommendation. So, we have one of 3 national licenses for medical device class 2. Doesn't mean that you can't do other things there, but this is definitely where the government is going to go to look for these particular solutions. And to be fair and objective, I believe the city of Guangzhou had a couple hundred science incubators or science parks. You need to have some kind of demarcation or some kind of identification system because there are just so many. Even within a country, I think most European countries don't have that many science park equivalents, whereas Guangzhou had 200 or 300. Sure. Just within itself. Yeah. So the entire Guangdong province. I mean, good Lord.
You mentioned elderly care as one of the sectors that could develop a bit first or further than the other ones. My understanding so far is that the level of nursing homes in China, there is no culture. My understanding is that there's not much of a culture of nursing homes in China. The elderly stay at home. And secondly, the level of nursing homes is indeed not at all. The average nursing home cannot take care of someone with Alzheimer type 3 or very, this kind of disease that you get when you are old. Would you mind sharing about what's the vision of elderly care, nursing homes, and because we are talking about beds at the same time, so I thought about nursing homes. Maybe it's broader than nursing homes.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's. I imagine that there's a vision paper that defines what they would like. If I had to guess, I'd say something generally where you have, full medical facilities on sites. But this is the tricky part. The way that you phrase the sort of facility you set up is everything. In other words, if it's medical facilities, as opposed to a wellness center, as opposed to full supportive care, as opposed to partial supportive care, as to having a medical facility as an affiliate or a partner, it really changes both the cost structure and the business model, and it also changes the kind of arm rails and guardrails and things like this that you would need to have to get licensure to be able to open your doors. Really quickly, in layman's terms, I think China wants to make sure that the people who can afford it can pay for really nice, baller kind of housing, really nice stuff. But I think the typical phrasing is, adequate or reasonable prosperity, right? And I think it holds true in healthcare. You don't need to have, fancy marble everywhere in your house in order to have an appropriate elder care facility. I think having a reasonably clean facility and access to medical expertise when it's needed, I'd say that's much closer to the vision and the hope, as opposed to what a lot of groups initially wanted to build. Investment firms wanted to come in and build these really, really swanky hospitals and big fancy facilities. At the end of the day, the decision makers and the people who are paying the bills are the children and maybe the grandchildren. And they're okay to spend the money, but their parents are not okay to have that money spent on them. So there's this very, very difficult culture pull where they just don't want it. They really are uncomfortable, and not all, but until you have kind of a groundswell of people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, all staying there, and it's kind of like a college dormitory and everybody hangs out. Right now, the college dormitory atmosphere for that is the local park that is close to the family home. So until you can kind of transplant that into an elder living facility, I don't know how you change that culture.
It's very interesting what you just said. Actually, someone want to analyze the pricing and how much they can price, and if they could price anything actually for such a service like elderly community system or nursing homes, would ask their children, because usually the children helping. But actually the parents would be against it because they used to live in conditions where they could actually accept a lot from difficulties and so on. So they wouldn't accept the children and grandchildren to pay. That's a very, very interesting point. And that's actually a very good transition to the public-private system and the payment of the system. How does it work in China? When you have a disease, do you need to pay to go to good hospitals? You don't need to pay? Do you need to work in order to be reimbursed, to pay those 社保险? To what extent there is a room for a private insurance or for a private sector here? Because I feel that my understanding is that the public sector is quite good and it's taking care of a lot of things for not that much money, if my understanding is correct. So how could you explain to someone who is new to this industry on how this system is working of social protection, healthcare protection, insurance?
Sure. I have actually given lectures on this that are hours long. So I'll try and condense and just give bullet points. It's complicated. It depends very much on your hukou. If you have a identification card or a hukou that says you're from, not to pick on any province, I really don't want to name a province, but let's say it's not, affiliated with Beijing or Shanghai, but you live and work there, but you haven't transitioned your hukou to Beijing or Shanghai. You can still get coverage through the public insurance. Really, really high level is you show up, you pay for services rendered, and then you file for reimbursements. And it depends on the hospital. Sometimes there's a long queue or guahao. There are some digital health companies that have been built to try and smooth that over so you can book in advance online. So you don't have to come and stay in a hotel for a week before you can be seen. And you pay for all of it out of pocket. And there is an honesty to every day. The doctor comes and checks on you if you're an inpatient and says, hey, you've been here for 3 days. We believe the right amount of time for you to be here is 5 days. So in another 2 days, we recommend, unless something changes, we recommend that you go home. You don't need to be here any longer. And also there's this backlog of patients. We need the bed. So historically, there's been an understanding of that. And then you reimburse afterward. So you're paying cash for most all of it up front. And I believe it depends on your income, the kind of public insurance that your company is paying for, the tier of remittance based on how much reimbursement you'll receive. And it's roughly similar for private, although I think they cover some of it up front. The same sort of thing though. If you have private, it doesn't cover all public insurance, public hospitals. So typically, if you have private insurance, you'll go to a private hospital. It's just kind of like an API that plugs in more smoothly to something. And yeah, same sort of process. It's depending on the company, the insurance company, it may take 30 to 60 to 90 days for full reimbursements. They'll have prior approvals, just like most countries. Getting medicines covered, you'll have your donut. For making sure you've met your deductible and if you've spent too much. So a lot of that is very similar. There's a huge amount that's changing though. So a big pain point historically is if a Chinese patient wants to seek medical care overseas, they couldn't use their insurance overseas. So you're starting to see a really large amount of innovation in this space. So private insurance companies in China that are trying to bridge that gap. There's a lot happening there. And also trying to help domestic or public insurance companies be able to be more innovative with the data that they collect. So there's a lot happening in that space. Again, we could talk all day about this, but there are a handful of companies. If you want, I can, there's a company named Ignatica, which is in China Accelerator. I believe this most recent cohort that's doing some really fascinating work. And there was a company, I'll send you the name of it, that I worked with in 2019. And they were talking about the novel kinds of medical tourism insurance products that they're developing. I believe it was specifically for cancer care, because it's very common for Chinese patients to seek cancer care overseas. So there's the beginnings of a large product offering in these spaces.
We will put the additional information in the notes. To give a picture, to what system do you think the Chinese system is the closest to? To the NHS in England, to the French social system, to the German one, to the Japanese one? What would you? I guess the American one would be maybe the furthest. But
yeah,
what's the closest for you?
That's a good question. I'm kind of a healthcare nerd, so typically when I travel to a new country, like my hobby is to go and actually map out what the health system looks like. And I got to be honest, I don't think anything is quite like it. It's definitely not like the NHS, so far as I can tell, because China has tried to build an NHS spine kind of digital health infrastructure a couple times, and it hasn't succeeded. So a lot of the patient health data in China is siloed.
I see.
So for that reason, I would not say it's like the NHS. I mean, in some regards it is, but in really famous regards like the Spine project, it's not. But I'm American, so I think about the U.S. health system and I go, that's not it. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm here in Thailand and there's a lot of medical tourism and a significant number of public hospitals and some really, really high-end private hospitals. Vietnam, maybe it's closest to Vietnam in the sense that they have a lot of really high-end English-speaking doctors in public hospitals and a really small but fast-growing number of high-end medical care for IVF or stem cell treatments or these sorts of things. People don't quite realize that Vietnam is trying to become like a massive global medical tourism site. Maybe that's been not spoken about much. Everybody thinks of Thailand, which is fair enough. But Vietnam could rapidly outpace Thailand and make it obsolete. So I'd say maybe it's closest to that as well, because the Hainan Haikou, Boao, and also the Beidaihe, which is not far from Beijing. Those are the three major hubs that China is trying to create into these really strong medical tourism hubs. So they don't want every hospital to be like that, but they want there to be these important strategic locations for medical tourism. So something if you live in the north, something if you live in the south, and maybe something a little bit central.
I'm asking you the question because when I was in Beida, I had a professor called Gordon Liu, and he was traveling to France frequently to actually learn from the social system, healthcare system in France, and to advise the government on some aspects of some reforms. It was 10 years ago. And I haven't heard much about what has been implemented out of those studies and trips and so on. So I was curious to have your view, and it seems that China is still very, very unique in its own system. We mentioned before we started the call COVID-19. And
yes, I've heard of it.
Of course, that has changed a lot of things in for your business, for healthcare. Generally speaking, you just mentioned medical tourism, which is basically at a stop now because of COVID-19, right? So, how much has what has changed for you with COVID-19? I know you have coordinated some support in finding equipment for COVID-19. Could you elaborate more about about that. I myself, to share a bit of some experience. I collected money to send masks to hospitals in Lyon, in France, with my alumni from my business school, and it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare to find the right factories. It was a nightmare to actually get the mask, because we sent some alumni to go to the factory, and everyone was lining up, and then it was closed. He couldn't even go to the factory. It was closed, finished. It was sold out. You had to go to the factory to get your mask. And then we got fake certificates sometimes. So we stopped everything. Then started again. And then the borders were closed. And we had to wait again to show more certification. And finally, we worked with Sinopharm, I think, which was a very good actually partner based in Shanghai, and that worked out. And very, very luckily, finally, we got those 9,000 masks, which is not huge, but it was our contribution to the hospital of Lyon. So, what's your experience with this very, very special moment?
You see a lot about the character of a person, and about, based on how they treat business right now. So when COVID first started, actually the reason I'm in Thailand initially is because I just worked too hard at the end of last year, and I had my lungs needed a break from Beijing. That's actually what my doctor in Beijing told me. He said, you need to find humidity and heat that will help. If you wait here, it'll take 2 to 3 months to heal. If you go somewhere with that, it'll take 2 to 3 weeks. Like, okay, fine, I'll go to a beach. And then COVID hit, and I got pulled on to some World Economic Forum COVID task force conversations. And we immediately started working with federal governments. And my experience, to summarize, is a lot of people have made a lot of money. Some have done ethical business. Unfortunately, most have not. The fake certificates, in my apartment in Beijing, we have 30,000 masks sitting some were real, some were fake. And, we just ate the loss. I wanted to make sure that didn't get sent to people that needed real products. When the wave started, wave meaning the PPE, not the COVID infection rates. When people first started to need products, it was masks first, and then it became ventilators, and then it was 3M masks, and then it was isolation gowns. But for the last 6 months, it's been gloves. And so ironically enough, I find myself in Thailand and Southeast Asia more broadly, which is where about 80% of all the gloves in the world are made. So I find myself really in the thick of it, and not the least of which because we're working with a large government project here that is helping to set up manufacturing lines for this. Thailand is a huge producer. I think the number 1, number 2 in the world for rubber.
Malaysia is a big one, right?
Yes, Malaysia is huge. Malaysia is for gloves. I think for what's called NBR, the raw material required to make nitrile gloves. There are 7 major refineries for this. But in terms of just glove numbers overall, there's a fantastic report you can find on ASEAN, ASEAN, and it's a CITIC report, CITIC. I think it'll set you back like $5,000. But if you have $5,000 to burn and you really want to learn about gloves, it's a good read. Essentially, we set our profit margins very clear. We're very transparent. We don't want to make any more than 35%. And I think if we're able to really provide value, I don't think anyone would fight that. So we worked with CARICOM, which is the trade association for all of the Caribbean and Latin America. We worked very closely with the government of India, and we advised a handful of countries in Europe. And we're now working very closely with Thailand, Malaysia, and Philippines. We're looking in the future to work in Middle East. We attempted to work in a few other geographies where we'll just say that unexpected hands in the kitty led to things not going quite as they could have otherwise. But yeah, I think it depends. If you talk with anyone who's done kind of PPE trading, which is where I find myself at the moment, they'll have happy days and just days of frustration because there's so much money at play. I mean, Malaysia, for example, printed 3 billionaires in the first half of 2020.
Yeah.
The state of California lost $600 million in one deal.
Wow.
So we're talking like, even if you get a fraction of this or a fraction of that, it's really life-changing money. And that's why I say you learn a lot about the character of people, is because, you know, you do that for $200,000, like, oh. So, yeah. But overall, you know, you're starting to see a lot more sophisticated people in the space. You're starting to see a lot more transparency, which is what we're very heavily involved in. One of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast actually is just to be able to talk about it, you know, and really start to answer questions. And yeah, I mean, there's just a huge amount of non-transparency over the past 6 to 9 months in the space. But I think overall, it's been very rewarding, because I didn't get into it to make money. I really, really wanted to just make sure people got what they needed. And the first thing you said was you coordinated a donation of masks. And that was the first thing that I did. I coordinated with some fantastic people in California to raise money and then donate 500,000 masks in Hong Kong. Because if you remember, as it was starting, I think Thailand and maybe it was Hong Kong roughly at the same time, they had their first major outbreak. And I have some good friends who are medical students or medical doctors practicing in Hong Kong. And I was so scared. And they were sending me pictures and messages, you know, nearly crying, because they just didn't have what they needed. So it's been amazing to see the outpour of support and just the humanity. I think that gets lost a lot in the you know, the craze of media generally today, where people forget that, you know, every time you see one bit of bad news, there's 2 or 3 where people are really trying to do some good.
That's very true. We should have done more on the good actions, which are not highlighted enough. I guess it sells less than the bad ones in newspapers.
Yeah, there was I forget which MIT professor published it, but somebody did the research and actually showed that bad news travels faster and further. Like our brains are just kind of miswired for positivity. Like we're kind of risk assessment machines. We're always trying to figure out how to avoid this. So we need to see the negative.
You mentioned
social media doesn't do us good. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
You mentioned on your website, or I don't know if Sophia, who prepared the interview with you, mentioned to me that you are using some tools to reinforce transparency on suppliers and on your supply chain. And you mentioned the word cryptographic tools.
Yes.
So is it? Maybe we talk about those big words like blockchain and so on. What are you talking about? Yeah. I don't know, but a lot of people are using the word blockchain that actually is basically, it's basically actually there is even a server centralizing it, which is our blockchain. But so what is a cryptographic tool you're mentioning?
Sure. So it's a product that is built using SATO protocol, and it is actually using blockchain. And the entire vision of it is, we want buyers to be able to know when they have sent money or sent in a PO, that what they're receiving is what they have paid for. And so actually being able to trace it every step along the way on the supply chain. So, okay, your order's been received by the factory. Here's an update from the factory. Here's a picture from the factory. Okay, now your goods have been put into a truck and it is going to the airport to clear customs. Here's a picture. Here's the tracking number. And so on and so forth until it's actually arrived at your doorstep. And we started it simply because, shout out to Jamaica, very patient with us, really put up with all the headaches. We had a significant amount of capital that we had, put into a factory, and the goods were fantastic. But until they cleared customs and until they were on that plane, we just didn't have any documentation to show them. Nothing. And I mean, sight unseen, millions of dollars to, and this is for, not the richest economy in the world. And they, to their benefit or, to their positivity, they, within 48 hours of sending us the initial RFQ, they wired the money and they paid up front. Really like putting their trust in DHB. And we're happy that it went very well. But being able to solve that as a pain point after first deal closed, it was like, oh God, like the amount of sleepless nights that everybody involved had, and there just wasn't a simple solution for it. So that's kind of an optional service that we've offered. And thankfully, what we've been able to do is simplify it. So now we can work with some of the supply companies. They, much bigger companies, larger tech teams. But that's what we actually built in-house so that we could just show something, share something. And now that our supply chain is broader than just China, that was built to run through WeChats, QR codes, these things.
I see.
And now because a lot of our goods are running in Thailand and Malaysia, it's a little bit harder to do. For all the PPE still in China, yes, but about 80% of what we do now is gloves. So WeChat isn't as popular in Thailand.
I see. You contribute to the growth of WeChat here. So what I understand that in every step of the supply chain, there was a QR code to scan with a couple of maybe, and then you pop up a questionnaire maybe to say put this information or take a picture with a mini program, and you were uploading that then to a server to the buyer. Am I correct on the process? I see.
That's right. It was really just to allow live updates, and when a request needed to be made, or if a step appeared that it had been taken but they didn't receive any update, then they could make that request. They could follow up with us and say, "Hey, is everything okay?"
I see. But that requires the suppliers, the logistics, all the people involved to accept to do it, which is not easy, I believe, because you might people change. You force your suppliers to use your own processes. Usually, it's like Apple or Microsoft who can do that. But when you are a small player, to force your suppliers to set up new processes and respect them, it's harder.
Ultimately, not so much, because a lot of the factories, they keep their inventory through various mini programs on WeChat.
I see.
So we didn't require them to really learn a new behavior. It was just one more step. So adding one more step does create a little bit more friction, but it wasn't like we were asking them to do something that they didn't understand. And then being able to find a logistics partner that's, you have one person from the moment that it's picked up at the factory all the way through customs clearance, being able to, make the updates and uploads themselves, saved a huge amount. So finding the right logistics partner. And then once things have landed in the US, in the country of purchase, the destination country, making sure that there's somebody there, a customs agent or a clearance agent, or the actual end buyer team, so that they can verify it themselves. That's a really, really important step. But it was less complicated than I thought, because what we did, again, we weren't looking to make any money from it. We just wanted assurance. Like, I know you wired us a lot of money. Let's make sure that you feel trusted and respected. And so it was really like, we're going to make sure that we pay a little bit more for the right logistics team that can help with this. So we kind of ate the premium to make sure that quality and transparency was there.
I'd like to end the interview with a series of questions about your experience in China and your journey as an entrepreneur. Would you have any books that inspired you and you'd like to share, inspired you as an entrepreneur, and you'd like to share with the audience?
A book I've been rereading recently is called Measure What Matters by John Doerr. I find that book really helpful. I haven't done the traditional reading of, 0 to 1 and, Startup Bible and these things. I'm much more of an autodidact. If I have a specific thing that I need to learn, I've been very, very fortunate through the communities I've been part of to be able to just go and learn. If I need somebody to break down basic accounting 101, I can go and speak with, directors at KPMG. So, buyer beware, don't always take my approach. I've been very, very, very blessed to have, surrounded myself with people much more talented than I.
What do you do to stay? What do you read to stay up to date on China and healthcare more specifically? You read Chinese, so I believe you read Chinese sources. You may read also foreign sources, English sources. I mean, sources in English. What do you do? What's your routine, your process to be up to date?
Mm-hmm. Sure. If your Mandarin is really good, you can identify which of the Chinese companies and the science parks and the research departments and the professors are doing interesting things, and then read their posts. Dongguan has Dongguan Kejugongyar has a very active WeChat account and quite a few others. But really, what I do to stay as up to date as possible is I just very fortunately have quite a few WeChat groups, and I'll spend an hour a day, at the beginning or the end of the day, just going over, reading, taking notes, and identifying 1 to 2 articles a day that I really need to focus on. And overall, I think FT has a really helpful app on your phone. If you want to improve your Mandarin, it's useful as well, because I think you can have a translation or at least pinyin. But I think at the end of the day, you have to be there. That the way that I describe it is, I've been able to internalize a lot of what makes the Chinese health system tick, and I don't, the frame is built in my head at this point. And now that I'm boots on the ground in Thailand, trying to do that same kind of mental infrastructure building here for how things operate here and how it compares or contrasts with China. So I find content, it's really being able to figure out the nuts and bolts of the policy, the finance, the academics, and who are the stakeholders and how do they operate. And once that's very clear, then it's being able to have live conversations with these people. Instead of just reading too much of what's published, go to the primary source. Okay, sure, that's what was said. You were quoted in this article. Was this your intention? Is this what you were trying to say? So you'd be surprised. I found it very surprising how easy it is to reach out to people who are quoted that would love to clarify. If there's something you're really interested in, write a thoughtful message on LinkedIn or find someone's email, or people respond very positively. So I found that to be a really good route.
I have the same experience with very well written email, adapted with a precise point. You get an answer.
Exactly.
Then what book on China? I'm sure you have read a lot of things about China or from China books. You mentioned Lao Tzu in some conferences, Sophia told me. What books on China have been game-changing for you? I mean, I've changed your way of understanding China, helped you to learn much more about China.
I think Kissinger's book is one that I've gone back to.
On China.
I've gone, because you said on China, so that immediately pops into my mind. Again, there are always white papers that I'm reading. I like I like the China File sites. FT does a great job. I'm sure I'm going to forget. I have quite a few friends in media. So 5+ years ago, maybe 7+ years ago, I would read everything. I would spend 3 to 5 hours every day just reading. And then, quite a few of my friends ended up becoming some of the journalists or the reporters or the producers. So then it was like, we would all go out to dinner and just have those conversations. And an old friend of mine, Kaiser Guo and Jeremy Goldkorn, who do the Sinica podcast, in the pop-up Chinese studio, I was actually in those rooms and listening to those for years. So again, like right place, right time. And then it would be, you go out after the interview and you're with, world famous Chinese scholar. You're just having a couple beers or a bite to eat, and just, 10 journalists come together and a handful of experts. So these kinds of impromptu events were the mainstay of just weekly life in Beijing for the better part of a decade. And so, I know I'm not giving you a specific answer on what books shaped me the most. I'd say On China was kind of a gate entry. It really helped me think more broadly about it. And then I just had a lot of questions, and I found people who had been there longer than me. Never be afraid to reach out to the 20+ year Lao Wai just around the corner. They'll have some stories and some perspectives.
If you had some extra time, what would you do? What idea would you pursue?
what idea would I pursue?
Yeah, what would you do? What would you do if you maybe another business and activity? You are very active. Actually, you are a child accelerator. You are Antler. You are a Schwarzman scholar. So you are already very active. But if you had extra time, and really, like, let's say you could start a new venture or something which would be take a lot of time, but you could do it. What would you do?
I really enjoy teaching. I enjoy the idea of being able to explain complex things very precisely. And I think at the end of the day, whether you're in finance or science or just an entrepreneur in general, whatever you do, your job is, number one, communication, and as a subset of that, sales. You need to be able to convince somebody of what you're saying. And I think the best way to do that is, very fresh, ambitious eyes and minds. So I miss being able to do that. Here in Thailand, I might start actually a longtime China hand, Jeffrey Towson, who had been at Beida for a number of years, is here, and I believe he's lecturing at the Chula MBA program. So I may throw my hat in the ring for that and just try and explain a little bit about the China health ecosystem. I would do a lot more of that. I would do more content writing as well, because getting your thoughts on paper really helps crystallize structures. And, as my staff can attest, my notebook has plenty of scribbles in it, and it makes sense to me, but perhaps not to them. So just having a little bit more time to provide a clearer, what does Doug's China roadmap look like, as opposed to, me running and everybody else trying to keep pace.
Last question. You meet 10 years ago, Douglas. What would you like to tell him? What would you like to know 10 years ago? You're in Dalian, right? So you have the opportunity to meet Douglas in Dalian. What would you tell him?
Make sure you focus on each of the Chinese characters you learn. And this will be a bit of a side note. The very first thing that I learned how to say in Chinese that gave me confidence that I could speak Chinese was ordering food at McDonald's.
So what did you? You learned all the words.
Order. Once I was able to say an entire order, which is what I refer, 麻辣鸡腿汉堡套餐，不要菜，不要酱，可乐不加冰. Like I want a spicy chicken sandwich, no veggies, no sauce, Coke no ice. When I was able to say all of that quickly, I was like, oh man, like I think I'm going to be able to survive here. And my family will laugh because that's how you were able to survive. It wasn't Chinese food. It was McDonald's. So yeah, really paying attention to being able to read, even to this day, like my reading is quite well. My Chinese friends give me a hard time because I can read, pretty professional text, but I'll have to go back and double check certain characters because the modifier, for yang, for lamb, or for yang, the yang, it has just a small change on the left side. If I had known at the very beginning, if you memorize what these mean, because each of these has a different inflection or influence on the base radical, oh man, that would have saved me hundreds of hours.
That's true. You actually you need to be very systematic at the very beginning to have very good foundation in Chinese. The grammar is not that difficult, but the understanding of each character, once you have in mind, it helps a lot then to memorize everything and so on. And maybe I would tell myself the same thing, and be harder on Chinese at the beginning. Yeah.
And this is going to age me a little bit, but there wasn't a Duolingo app, Pinduoduo, none of this existed. We still had to have like a thick dictionary, so for the first 6 months, I took a dictionary and a notebook and I went to the same restaurant every night. And the waitress in Dalian, God bless her, she would just speak with me and practice. So I heard the same, because you need to hear the same accents. That would be the other things. Make sure you hear the same accents all the time. And I didn't explicitly choose it. That was just my habit. I'm a creature of habit. But that saved me, because if you're in a city like Beijing, you're going to hear Beijing Arhuayin, you're going to hear Shanghai Hua, you're going to hear Zhejiang Hua. You're going to get so confused. You won't be able to recognize what Mandarin sounds like. So choosing a couple people to practice with who speak really standard Mandarin. And I was in Dalian, so like when I got to Beijing, people made fun of me because I had a Dongbei Hua. And now everybody gives me a hard time because it's a very Beijing Hua, Beijing Arhuayin.
Thank you very much for your time. It was very instructive, and I really was looking forward to this interview to learn more about healthcare. And you did open eyes on a lot of things. Very valuable experience you have here, and very very local one, deeply rooted in the heart of China in Beijing. Thank you very much for taking the time. For everyone listening to us, hope you enjoyed, and if you like it, please. Grade it with a 5-star or comment it. We'll be happy to see what you think about it. And we will put in the notes of the interview everything you would like to add, the names of companies and a couple of precisions you'd like to add. Thanks again, Douglas. I hope you enjoyed it. I did. And thanks for
Thank you very much, Matthew.